The morning Lady Clara Ashcombe was told she would not become the Duchess of Ravenmore, the London sky was the colour of wet pewter. And the ballroom of Ravenmore House smelled of hothouse lilies and old money. Every unmarried noblewoman in England had been summoned to that gilded room. Every silk skirt, every jewelled comb, every practised smile had been polished for one man. He stood on the marble staircase like a figure carved from winter itself, and one by one the daughters of dukes and earls sailed toward him as though he were a harbour. Clara did not sail. Clara stopped. Halfway across the square outside the great house, where the carriages rolled and the footmen shouted, she had seen an old woman kneeling in the mud, her basket overturned. Her bread rolling into the gutter, her hands too thin and too shaking to gather any of it. And so, while every noble bride in the kingdom chased the duke, Clara knelt beside a stranger and gathered ruined loaves into her arms. She would not know, until much later, that the duke had watched her from a high window. She would not know that the old woman was not a stranger at all. She would only know, that grey morning, that she had chosen mercy over marriage, and that the price of mercy in Regency England was rarely small. Clara Ashcombe was the third daughter of a viscount whose fortune had thinned like winter broth. Her gowns were remade from her mother's, her slippers had been resold twice. And her name appeared on the invitation to Ravenmore House only because her cousin Lady Honoria had insisted every eligible girl of decent blood be sent. So that the Duke of Ravenmore might have his choice and be done with the tedious business of choosing. The Duke, Sebastian Alaric Vale, had returned from 6 years abroad with a title, a fortune, 3 estates, and a face the papers had described as carved out of iron and indifference. He required a wife. He did not require love. He had made this clear to his solicitor, to his aunt, and to the whispering columns of the London Gazette. He would inspect the assembled ladies at a single reception, and by nightfall a name would be chosen. Clara had accepted the invitation because her father had wept. She had never seen him weep before, not even when they buried her mother. He had knelt in the study with his gouty legs stretched out and told her, in the frankest voice she had ever heard from him, that if she did not attract the Duke's eye, the family would lose Ashcombe Hall by Michaelmas. She had promised to try. She had put on the pale green gown that had once belonged to an aunt, and she had rehearsed a curtsy in the hallway until her calves ached. But on the morning of the reception, the carriage had let her out too early, and the square had been full of noise, and the old woman had fallen. Clara had not made a decision. Her body had. She was kneeling in the wet mud before she remembered that she was expected inside. The old woman had eyes the colour of rain-washed slate, and she had looked at Clara as though Clara were the strangest creature in London. "Child," she had said, "you will ruin your gown." Clara had answered, "It was already ruined, ma'am. It only pretends otherwise." She had walked the old woman 3 streets to a narrow doorway. She had bought new bread with the last coins her father had pressed into her glove. When at last she entered Ravenmore House, her hem was black with filth, her hair had escaped its pins, and a smear of dough sat upon her cheek. The Duke had already chosen Lady Honoria Devane. A cool blonde with a fortune of her own and a laugh like broken crystal. Clara stood at the edge of the ballroom, unseen, and understood that Ashcombe Hall was lost. What she did not understand, and what no one in that gilded room understood, was that the Duke of Ravenmore had watched the entire scene in the square from the tall east window. Had seen the girl kneel in the mud, had seen her walk the old woman home, and had said nothing at all. He had merely turned to his aunt and murmured, "The blonde will do. Announce it." He did not say why he sounded, in that moment, like a man burying something. Ashcombe Hall was sold within a month. Clara's father, ashamed and diminished, retreated to a cousin's house in Bath, taking his elder daughters with him. There was no room, he said, for Clara. She had been offered, quietly, a position. The Dowager Duchess of Ravenmore, the Duke's own great-aunt, required a companion at Thornfield Priory, a crumbling estate in the north that no one visited and no one loved. The wages were small. The winters were long. The offer had come, oddly, and signed, delivered by a boy on a grey pony. Clara accepted because she had nowhere else to go. The journey took 4 days. The roads worsened as she traveled north, the hedges thickened, the villages shrank, and by the last afternoon she was riding through a country of black hills and slate skies. Thornfield Priory rose out of the mist like a wounded animal. Half its west wing had burned in some forgotten year. Ivy had grown into the broken windows. A single lamp burned in the gatehouse. Inside, the hall smelled of damp stone and old smoke. The servants had shrunk to 5, a butler with a stiff knee, a cook who wept over her onions, 2 housemaids who had not been paid in a season, and a stable boy of perhaps 11 who slept in the tack room because the servants' hall roof leaked. The Dowager Duchess sat in a chair by a smoking fire, wrapped in 3 shawls. She was old. Her eyes were the color of rain-washed slate. Clara stopped in the doorway. The old woman looked up. "So," she said, softly, "you came." It was the woman from the London Square. Clara did not cry. She had learned, in the last 4 weeks, that tears were expensive. She only walked forward, took the thin hand offered to her, and knelt beside the chair as she had knelt in the mud. "Your Grace," she said, "you should not have troubled yourself for me." "I have troubled myself for no one in 40 years, the Dowager answered. "Do not flatter yourself that you are the exception." But her fingers, as they closed over Clara's, were not cold at all. That night, Clara ate bread and cheese in a room whose window would not shut. She wrote a letter to her father which she did not send. She counted the coins in her purse. She listed, in a small notebook, every task that Thornfield Priory required if it were to survive another winter. The list ran to 3 pages. She was 21. She had no allies, no fortune, and no name that anyone at Ravenmore cared to remember. In the morning she rose before dawn, tied an apron over her only good dress, and began. She began with the kitchen, because a house that could feed its people could think. She scoured the copper pans. She taught the weeping cook, whose name was Mrs. Halley, to make broth from the marrow the butcher had been throwing out. She walked to the village and paid the miller in mended linen for a sack of good flour. She stopped the 2 housemaids in the corridor and asked them their names, which no one had done in years. They were Bess and Anne, sisters. And they had a younger brother in the workhouse whom Clara promised to look into. She found the stable boy, Tom, and gave him her old cloak, which was too small for her but too large for him, and told him he would sleep henceforth in a proper bed by the kitchen fire. She opened the ledgers. This was the harder work. The estate's accounts had been kept by a steward who had died 2 winters back, and no one had opened the books since. Clara sat by candlelight for 6 nights and traced, page by page, where the money had gone. She found rents uncollected. She found a tenant farmer who had been paying twice for the same field because no one had told him the second demand was a forgery. She found a butcher's bill paid 3 times over. She wrote letters in a clean, small hand, and she signed them not with her own name but with the Dowager's, having asked permission first and received it with a single dry nod. The village began to notice. A woman had walked among them. A woman had asked their names. A woman had returned the miller's flour money and apologized for the previous year's short wait. By December there was smoke in every Thornfield chimney and the west wing had a canvas roof against the snow. By January the ledgers balanced for the first time in 7 years. The Dowager watched her from the fireside chair, saying little. Once, when Clara was reading aloud to her, the old woman closed her hand around Clara's wrist and said, "Child, why do you do all this? You will never inherit it." Clara considered the fire for a long moment. "Because it can be done, Your Grace. And because no one else is doing it." "That," said the Dowager, "is the most dangerous answer a woman can give in England." She did not explain what she meant. But the next morning a letter was dispatched to London, sealed with the Dowager's own ring, addressed in her own crabbed hand. Clara did not know of it. She was in the muddy garden, teaching Tom to prune the neglected pear trees, her fingers red with cold, her hair coming loose beneath her bonnet. Laughing for the first time in months at something the boy had said. A rider left the gates that afternoon, carrying the letter south. He rode hard. The Duke of Ravenmore arrived at Thornfield Priory on the 5th of February, in a snowstorm that had already killed 2 shepherds on the moor. He had come because his great-aunt's letter had contained 6 sentences, of which the last was, "If you do not come at once, Sebastian, you will lose something that cannot be bought back." He did not know what she meant. He had assumed she was dying. He had ridden 4 days without proper rest, and when he came at last through the gates of Thornfield he was expecting ruin. He found candlelight. He found the drive raked clear of snow, the lamps lit at the porch, the great door opened by a butler who stood straight despite his stiff knee. He found a hall that smelled of beeswax and pine. He found a fire in the drawing room whose logs were properly seasoned, and a tray of hot bread and cured ham that had been prepared, he understood at once, for a traveler. He had not sent word he was coming. Someone had known to prepare anyway. He asked for his great-aunt. He was told she was resting, and would receive him in an hour. He was shown to a room whose sheets were warm, whose water was hot, whose fire had been laid with care. He came down at last in dry clothes, and in the corridor he saw a woman with her back to him, giving instructions to a young maid about a poultice for a horse that had strained a foreleg. Her voice was low. It was competent. It was completely without fear. She turned. It was the girl from the square. He remembered her at once, though she was thinner now, and browner, and stood with a straight-back stillness that he had not seen in her a year ago. She did not curtsy. She inclined her head, and said, "Your Grace." "Her Grace will see you now." "I have had tea sent up." He said, foolishly, "You." "Miss Ashcombe, Your Grace." She was already moving past him. "Please follow me." She did not lead him as a servant leads a master. She walked ahead of him with the quiet authority of a woman moving through her own house. He followed. He noted, without meaning to, that the corridor's cracked plaster had been repaired, that the portrait of the 6th Duke had been cleaned, that the carpet ran unbroken to the dowager's door. He had not been to Thornfield in 9 years. He had remembered it as a ruin. It was not a ruin. Somewhere between the London ballroom and this northern doorway a mistake had been made. He did not yet know whose. In the dowager's sitting room, his great-aunt was upright in her chair, her hair pinned, her eyes bright. She held out her hand. He kissed it. She looked at him a long time. "Well, Sebastian," she said. "Have you come to see what a woman can build when a man does not choose her?" And Clara Ashcombe, who had been about to leave, paused with her hand on the door, and then, gently, closed it behind her. He stayed. He had not intended to. He had a wife waiting in London, or rather a fiancée, for Lady Honoria had delayed the wedding twice already on grounds of fashion, and he had a seat in the Lords, and a shipping interest in Bristol. And every reason in the world to be gone by morning. He stayed a week. Then 2. He told himself it was because the roads were bad. He told himself it was because his great-aunt's health required watching. He did not tell himself that he watched Clara Ashcombe every day, from windows, from doorways, from across the long dinner table where she sat at his great-aunt's right hand and spoke of drainage. Of tenant complaints, of a promising boy in the village who ought to be sent to school. She was courteous to him. That was all. She did not flirt. She did not seek his eye. She did not, as every other unmarried woman of his acquaintance did, lean forward when he spoke. She listened, and she answered when asked, and she returned to her own thoughts as though he were a piece of furniture that had recently been dusted. It offended him. Then it interested him. Then, at some point he could not name, it began to wound him. One evening he came upon her in the estate office, bent over the ledgers by a single candle. Her hair had loosened. Her sleeves were pushed to the elbow. She was writing figures, and her lower lip was caught between her teeth. He stood in the doorway a long moment before she looked up. "Your Grace." She rose. He said, "Sit. Please. I did not mean to disturb you." She sat. He did not leave. At last he said, "You were in the square that day." "In London?" "Yes. I saw you." She looked up. Her grey eyes were steady. "I know, Your Grace. Her Grace told me." He had not expected that. He had come to Thornfield believing he owned a secret. He owned nothing. He said, more quietly, "I should have come down." "Yes," she said. "You should have." There was no anger in her voice. That was the worst of it. There was only a small, clean statement of fact, delivered the way she might have observed that the fire needed a log. She returned to her ledgers. He went out into the cold garden and stood a long time under a moon like a chipped coin. In the morning a letter came from London. Lady Honoria had broken the engagement. She had, it was reported, formed an attachment to a marquis with better teeth. The paper spoke of scandal, of a woman scorned, of the Duke of Ravensmoor's humiliation. The Duke read it standing in the front hall of Thornfield Priory. He folded it neatly. He put it in the fire. He did not tell Clara. She heard the news 2 days later from Bess the housemaid, and she did not change her expression at all. The first mini-storm came in the shape of a neighbor. Lord Marley of Kestrel Grange, a stout man with small eyes and a large mortgage, arrived one afternoon in a barouche and declared that a strip of woodland along the eastern boundary had, by his reading of a document some 100 years old, belonged to Kestrel Grange all along. He wished it back. He wished, further, to purchase the water meadow beyond it, at a price that would have insulted a beggar. The dowager, who was tired that day, waved him toward Clara. Clara received him in the library. She had read the documents already. She had read them a month before, in fact, when she had first noticed the boundary stones did not match the estate map. She produced the older map. She produced the deed of 1732. She produced, from a bundle tied with black ribbon, a letter from Lord Marley's own grandfather acknowledging the transfer of the strip in payment of a card debt. Lord Marley reddened. He blustered. He suggested that a young woman of no rank had no business in such matters. The Duke, who had been listening from the next room, entered then. He did not speak. He merely stood behind Clara's chair with his hand resting on its back, and looked at Lord Marley with the flat courtesy of a man who had killed in the Peninsular War and did not intend to say so. Lord Marley left within the hour. When the door closed behind him, Clara turned in her chair and looked up at the Duke, and for the first time she seemed startled by him. He said, "You did not need me." "No, Your Grace. But you allowed me to stand there." "Her Grace is fond of you," Clara said. It seemed a kindness. He laughed, once, a rough sound she had not heard from him. He said, "You are the coldest kind woman I have ever met, Miss Ashcombe." She turned back to her papers. "I am not cold, Your Grace. I am careful. There is a difference. A woman without fortune learns it early." He stood a while longer. Then he said, in a voice she almost did not catch, "Forgive me." She did not answer at once. She set down her pen. She said, without looking up, "For what, Your Grace?" "For not coming down that day. In the square." A silence. Then, finally, she said, "You did not know me. You owed me nothing." "That is not," he said, "an answer to whether you forgive me." She looked up. Her face was very still. "No, Your Grace," she said. "It is not." She rose, gathered her papers, and left the room. He stood a long time before the empty chair. The winter deepened. He did not go back to London. He wrote to his steward, to his solicitor, to the lords, and remained. He learned Thornfield in a way he had never learned any of his estates. He rode out with Clara in the frozen mornings to inspect the drainage on the low fields. He sat with her in the kitchen while Mrs. Halley taught Bess to render lard, and he peeled an apple for the dowager with his own hands, which he had not done since he was a boy. He began to speak to Clara of things he had told no one. He told her, one evening, of his younger brother Edmund, who had died at Badajoz because Sebastian had not reached him in time. He told her that he had watched Edmund's face go white while an army surgeon looked at him and shook his head, and that he had been unable to weep, then or since. And that this was the true reason he had come home so cold. He told her that he had chosen Lady Honoria because Lady Honoria expected nothing of him, and a man who has nothing to give is safest with a woman who wants nothing but his title. She listened. She did not touch him. She did not offer comfort in the shape of empty words. She said only, when he had finished, "Your brother was loved. That is not nothing. And you have not forgotten him. That is also not nothing." He looked at her across the fire. He said, "You are unlike any woman I have known." "I am," she said, "a viscount's daughter who kept an old lady warm through a winter. There are 1,000 of us, Your Grace. Only most are never seen." He said, "I see you." She stood. She said, in a voice very low, "Please do not, Your Grace. It is easier for me if you do not." She left. He sat by the fire until it went out. 2 days later, disaster came. A blizzard closed the northern roads for 3 nights. On the second night, Tom the stable boy went missing. He had gone out to bring in a mare in foal and had not returned. Clara found her cloak, her heaviest boots, a lantern, and a length of rope. She was tying the rope at her waist in the stable yard when the Duke caught her by the arm. "You are not going out in that. The boy is out in that. Miss Ashcombe, your Grace." She did not raise her voice. "There is a child on the moor. Come with me, or step aside. Do not stand between." He came with her. They found Tom, at last, in a hollow behind the old sheepfold, wrapped around the neck of the mare who had foaled in the snow. The foal was alive. The boy was blue with cold. The Duke carried him 3 miles home through drifts to his chest, Clara carrying the lantern ahead. And they laid him by the kitchen fire and stripped him of his wet clothes and rubbed his hands until the skin came back to them. Mrs. Halley wept. Bess brought hot milk. The Duke sat on the stone floor with the boy in his lap, still in his soaked greatcoat, and when at last Tom opened his eyes and croaked, "Is the foal alive?" "Miss Clara," the Duke put his forehead against the boy's damp hair and did not lift it for a long time. Later, when the household was asleep and the fire had burned to embers, Clara found the Duke still in the kitchen, still in his ruined clothes, sitting on the flagstones with his back to the wall. She sat down beside him. She did not speak. After a long time she reached, quite simply, and took his hand. He turned his face into her shoulder. He wept, at last, for Edmund, and for the boy he had almost lost tonight, and for the girl in the mud he had watched from a window and had not gone down to. She held him. She did not say anything at all. Spring came slowly to the north. The snow melted in patches. Green appeared in the hedges. Tom recovered. The foal, named by common consent Mercy, thrived. The Duke did not leave. Word traveled. In London, the papers first speculated, then declared. The Duke of Ravenmore, it was said, had lost his mind in the north. He had taken up with a penniless viscount's daughter. He had abandoned his interests. He had been seen mending a fence. Lady Honoria's Marquis sent gloating letters that the Duke did not answer. His aunt in Grosvenor Square wrote demanding his return. He did not go. Then, at the end of April, the second test came, and it came in the shape of a letter from the Crown. The Duke was summoned to London to answer for his neglect of a Lords' Committee upon which he sat, and to resume, formally, the business of his line. He was expected to marry. He was expected to produce heirs. He was expected to remember, the Prince Regent's private secretary wrote, that a Duke of Ravenmore was not a country steward. He read the letter in the library. Clara was at the far end of the room, arranging cuttings from the garden in a stone jug. He read it twice. He rose. He walked the length of the library. He came to a stop before her. She looked up. She saw his face. She set down the jug. She said, very steadily, "You must go, Your Grace." Clara. He had not called her that before. Sebastian. She used his name once, as one might touch a hot pan to know it. Then she stepped back. "You must go. It is your duty. I have always understood that. You have never understood any such thing. I have, Your Grace. It is why I did not answer you last month." He took the letter out. He held it out to her. She did not take it. He said, "I have 3 estates. I have a seat in the Lords. I have 4 ships in the Bristol trade. I have a name that has stood in England since the 14th century. I know. None of it," he said, "is home." She did not move. "I have lived in 8 houses. I have owned 200 rooms. I have never entered a single one of them and felt what I felt when I came through your gate in February. The house I remembered as a ruin. The house I had forgotten. The house where a woman I did not choose knelt beside a boy on a stone floor and gave him back his life. Clara. I do not want to go to London to answer for my line. I want to answer for my life. To you." She was very pale. She said, "You will regret this. In a year. In 2 years. When your name is a joke in every drawing room in Mayfair. Let it be a joke," he said. "I am tired of being a title. I want to be a man." She looked at him a long time. She said, quietly, I am not a woman who can be your regret, your grace. I have been discarded once. I will not be discarded twice. He knelt. He did it plainly, without flourish, on the worn library carpet where she had spent so many nights over the ledgers. He said, then discard me first, Clara Ashcombe, if you must. But hear me. I saw you in the square. I watched you kneel in the mud for an old woman I did not know was my own blood. I stood at that window and I let you walk away because I was a coward, and I had told myself that a man who felt nothing could not be broken further. I was wrong. I was wrong that day, and I was wrong every day I did not ride north sooner, and I have been wrong about every woman who ever sailed across a ballroom toward me. The only woman I ever wished to marry was the one who did not. She did not speak. She was looking at him as she had looked at him that first night by the dowager's chair, steadily, gravely, without flattery. He said, marry me. Not because I am a duke. Because I am the man who watched you and did not come down, and who is coming down now, and who will spend the rest of his years coming down. She said, at last, and her voice shook only a little. Get up, Sebastian. He stood. She took his hand. She said, I will marry you. Not because you asked kneeling. Because you asked truly. And because a home is not a place, and I would like ours to be built by both of us. He raised her hand and put it against his cheek. He held it there. From the doorway, a dry old voice said, well. Finally. The Dowager Duchess stood in the library door, leaning upon her stick, smiling the smile of a woman who had written a whole winter's game to the exact ending she had planned. She said, Sebastian, dear. Do come in for tea. Clara, my dove. You will find, in the small chest beneath my bed, a deed. Thornfield is yours. It has been yours since Michaelmas. I signed it over the day you paid the miller his short wait. I was only waiting to see whether my great-nephew had the wit to notice you before he lost the last thing worth having in this family. She turned and hobbled away toward the drawing-room, calling for Mrs. Halley to bring the good china. They were married in the village church at the end of May. Clara wore a gown that had been remade from her mother's, only more finely this time, and a veil the dowager had worn at her own wedding 60 years before. Her father came from Bath. He wept again. Tom carried the ring on a cushion. The Duke, before the altar, took Clara's hand and said, before God and 40 villagers and one gray-eyed old woman in the front pew, I saw you kneel in the mud. I will kneel beside you all my life. Later, in a summer that would come slowly to that northern country, they would rebuild the West Wing. They would open a village school in Edmund's name. They would ride out at dawn along the boundary stones. The dowager would live 3 more years, long enough to hold their first child, a girl with gray eyes, and to whisper to Clara, on the last evening of her life, you were the only one who stopped. Child. That is why you were the only one worth choosing. And when the story of the Duke of Ravenmore was told in London drawing-rooms, as it was told for many years afterward, it was told this way. That once, on a grey morning outside a great house in Mayfair, every noble bride in England had chased a duke across a ballroom, and one girl had stopped to help a lonely old woman in the square. And by that stopping had won not the ballroom, but the men, and not the men, but a life. And that was the whole of it. That was the beginning and the end. If this story warmed your heart, if Clara's quiet strength and Sebastian's long journey home moved you even a little, please take a moment to leave a like, share your favorite scene in the comments, and pass this tale along to another reader who loves an earned, tender romance. Subscribe to our channel for more stories of overlooked women, humbled dukes, and the small mercies that change the shape of a life. Until next time, dear listener, keep a candle in your window, a kind word for a stranger, and, always, a stubborn hope in your heart.